leave at the moment. Tonight we're joined by eminent scholar from the University of British Columbia, Associate Professor Sheryl Lightfoot. Sheryl did her PhD at the University of Minnesota, and she's Anishinaabe, a citizen of Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe. In 2018, Sheryl was appointed to the role of Senior Advisor to the President, that's the equivalent of our Vice-Chancellor, on Indigenous Affairs, a position within the First Nations House of Learning. She's an Associate Professor in First Nations and Indigenous Studies and at the Department of Political Science. Sheryl's a Canadian Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics, and in addition to all her academic work, she has 15 years volunteer and contract experience with a number of American Indian tribes and community-based organisations in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Her book, Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution, was published by Routledge in May 2016, and we're going to hear from Sheryl tonight drawing on some of that work. She's going to be speaking about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the steps needed to implement Indigenous rights with Indigenous communities in mind. So I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Sheryl.
Thank you so much. Kia ora, and I would also like to introduce myself to you in my language, Anishinaabe Mowin. Buju Anishinaabe, Ginu Ikwe Nindishnikaz, Ginu Nindudem, Kiwina Gichigumi Nindujiba, Masquiam Ninda, Nidi Chi Nandam Mayayan, Chimigwich. In English, I said, hello, my brothers and sisters. My name is Golden Eagle Woman, and in my Anishinaabe language, and Sheryl Lightfoot in English. I come from the Eagle clan of Keweenaw Bay on what the English speakers like to call Lake Superior, but we call the Great Spirit Lake, or Gitchagumi. I live on the territory of the Musqueam people, or what the English now call the city of Vancouver. And I'm very delighted to be here with you today, and I really appreciate the invitation. I want to open by acknowledging, first of all, and thanking the Maori people, the traditional owners and caretakers of this land. And many thanks as well to the Public Policy Institute for the invitation here at the University of Auckland, especially to Jennifer Curtin for the invitation, and special thanks also to Lincoln and to Suzanne for all of the help with the arrangements. And I appreciate the very warm welcome. I want to begin by sharing a little bit about myself, my background that informs of this work that I've been doing for so many years, and how it is always tightly connected to my research and my advocacy agendas. So I want to always, when I'm traveling overseas, show you the maps, because I know not everyone is as familiar with North America. And so I've highlighted the Great Lakes area of North America, which you can see is more or less slightly east of the middle of the continent and sits right on the border region of the US and Canada. And then here's a little bit of a close-up vision so you can see I come from Lake Superior, which is not only the biggest of the lakes, obviously, by its name in English, but it is the most western of the lakes. And the red circle, or the red square, is my community. So it's jutting right out into the lake. It is actually on the American side, and as I will come to talk about, Indigenous rights, including how to cross borders freely, has been an ongoing issue in my life. So I've also circled the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul because in a moment you'll see why that area is important to me as well. And I always say, since years and years ago, that although I was born right on the border, because the border splits Lake Superior right in half from north to south, that border is not ours. It came to us. We've been living in that part of the continent for somewhere around 10 or 12,000 years, depending on when the last ice went out at the end of the Ice Age. The border is very new. It's only been there about 200. If we were to count up all of the Anishinaabe people on both sides of the border and across all the communities, and we were unified, we would be one of the largest, if not the largest, indigenous nation in North America. Just a few views from home, just to bring this place to life. Just wanted to show you a little bit of what our land looks like, our lake, because we are most definitely a water people, albeit a freshwater people, and then some of my family. So when I was round about 5 years old, my mother packed up her car with her 2 young daughters and everything that she could stuff into that car, a rickety old car, and we moved to the city of Minneapolis. You remember the circle that I put also on the map. And as I often say, that's when my current research began at the age of 5, because we arrived into Minneapolis in the summer of 1972, which is an incredibly important moment in American Indian activist history. The American Indian movement had formed in the city in the late 1960s, and it had already been part of a strong activist takeover of Alcatraz outside the city of San Francisco, and it had many other major events just about to break. So in 1972, the Trail of Broken Treaties conducted by the American Indian movement actually began in Minneapolis. And it actually began in my uncle's office. So my uncle, Raymond Lightfoot, who's the gentleman sitting at the desk, was the newly installed Minneapolis area director of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, actually the first American Indian area director ever appointed in the Bureau. And this photo is of him in heavy negotiations with the American Indian movement at the time, who were demanding his resignation. He managed to negotiate a waiver. He asked for some time because he had only just begun to address some of the longstanding issues in the Bureau of Indian Affairs that he had inherited from a long line of non-Indigenous predecessors. So at the end of this day, the American Indian movement decided to move on to Washington, D.C., where they then occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, headquarters building there, with much different results from what they had seen in Minneapolis. So just a snapshot. Throughout my own professional life, I've moved back and forth between Indigenous advocacy work and some international work, and eventually merged the two into my academic career, which began in about the mid-2000s when I returned for my PhD mid-career. So when I speak to you about these issues, I'm definitely speaking from the perspective of a political scientist, a self-described policy wonk, and an academic, but I'm also speaking to you as an Anishinaabe person, an Indigenous person who's experienced firsthand many of the impacts of colonialism. So 2 generations of my family coming through residential schools, land theft, state control over the movement of in our traditional territories, which now crosses borders that were established without our consent, state institutions that deliver unequal services to Indigenous peoples, and national determinations of our Indigenous identity that conflict with our own. So I'm an Indigenous person who is solutions-driven and who's been heavily influenced by those who came before me to try to find better approaches, to find human rights-based approaches to making things better for people on the ground, and in the process, hopefully produce improved relationships with governments and other peoples who are now residing in our lands. So in my time with you this evening, I'd like to speak about how I view Indigenous rights as potentially paving a new path, a revolutionary path, or perhaps we could speak of it as an evolutionary path. It's a long-term path toward an entirely new future in law, in governance, and in our societies. But it's a future that will require all of us to make great efforts to think outside of our existing structural boxes. So in my time with you tonight, I'd like to spend some time discussing implementation of Indigenous rights, or how we turn the principles of Indigenous rights into practices that benefit real people on the ground. So I've been at the University of British Columbia, or what we call UBC, since 2009. And several years back, as Jennifer mentioned, I was appointed as Canada Research Chair of Global Indigenous Rights and Politics. And in that role, I have been engaged in a significant amount, an ongoing amount, of collaborative work with Indigenous organizations across Canada and an international network of academics who all research and advocate for Indigenous human rights. And I have to pause and say that at UBC, we always acknowledge the territory which we call is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people in order to acknowledge their 10,000-year presence on the territory where the university now sits. And unceded in that acknowledgement means that the land we're on was never actually given up by the Musqueam people in any way, never through treaty, never through sale, and not any other means. This creates some complications for us as a university community, obviously. And in fact, treaties were never signed in most of the province of British Columbia, in contrast to the rest of Canada, but rather land was simply taken and Indigenous peoples of these lands forcibly relocated to very small reserves. So what is this subtle revolution of global Indigenous politics? While Indigenous peoples around the world are often dismissed as marginal non-state actors, and Indigenous rights are often cast off as merely aspirational, you may have heard that term before, non-binding, I'm sure you've heard that term before, and unenforceable, and I know we hear that term a lot. But I argue something's happening that's quite the contrary. Now, the title of my book is Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution. And in the book, I argue that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is something much more than just a set of rights that's emerging and diffusing on the global stage, but rather, it represents a moment of potential revolutionary transformation, often overlooked and certainly underappreciated. Now, the body of Indigenous political and legal theory that's emerged and blossomed really since the 1990s speaks directly to colonial assumptions of international politics and intervenes in openings that were provided by earlier generations of post-colonial scholars. And if we examine international politics through the lens of Indigenous political theory, we see a very problematic global state of what we can politely refer to as incomplete post-coloniality. It's a state of settler colonialism that has never ended, and it results from the institutional, the structural exclusion, if not erasure, of Indigenous peoples in existing systems of governance. And Indigenous political and legal theory calls for, rather, a more post-colonial completion project through Indigenous inclusion, but more importantly, accommodation. This global post-colonial challenge, however, is that Indigenous inclusion and accommodation are not as easy as previous generations of human rights. Because when we do so, we are ultimately forced to rethink some not so small things that we take for granted: the state, what we mean by decolonization, the form of liberalism that we have grown accustomed to in several hundred years of European contact, rethink what diplomacy means and how we do it. And here's a big one: Westphalian sovereignty. So I hope to cover two of the main arguments that come out of my book, but then I also want to take some time to look forward from where my book ends and drops off. So the first argument is that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the UNDRIP as it is very unaffectionately known, always run your acronyms, always, or you may end up with something unappealing like UNDRIP. I argue that it was a significant global achievement because it represents this overlooked and underappreciated transformational moment in global politics. Because from its earliest beginnings, the Indigenous rights movement, which I witnessed as a small child in Minneapolis at its earliest beginnings, did by simply seeking recognition of Indigenous rights, by definition sought a fundamental set of transformational changes in the United Nations, in the human rights system, and in the wider international system. And some of these changes are small, but others are much larger and what I now call subtly revolutionary. The Declaration is a remedial document, and it's intended, of course, to rectify the widespread systematic denial of human rights to Indigenous peoples, both in national and in global contexts. And it includes a set of major global changes that will impact most nation states, but particularly the settler colonial states of Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And the second argument follows from the first. Because the transformational nature of Indigenous rights, the real potential of the UN Declaration lies in its implementation. So in other words, its potential lies in its very potential. And the potential that lies within implementation involves significant global change, domestic change, change which cannot simply be compartmentalized for Indigenous peoples within existing systems. It ultimately requires wider systemic changes. Now, I posit that the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights actually represent four fundamental changes, not only to the rights of Indigenous peoples, but to the conduct of wider global politics. So first, the adoption of the UN Declaration represented the first time in international history that a broad set of collective rights was accepted in the human rights consensus. Now, the Indigenous rights movement, again, from those very beginnings when I was a little girl, had argued and asserted that an exclusively individual rights focus of human rights and human rights framing was insufficient to accommodate Indigenous peoples' rights. Indigenous peoples also, on top of individual human rights, needed protections as collectives, as groups, especially in the area of cultural rights, land rights, and of course, political self-determination. And the United Kingdom, together with its friend the United States and its other interested parties like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, all expressed long-standing concerns about the incompatibility between collective rights and individual human rights, arguing that any recognition of collective rights leaves individuals within groups inherently vulnerable and without the protection provided by human rights. And some of the Indigenous activists that I interviewed that had worked throughout the Cold War years reported that the United States was forever and always vociferously opposed to any international instrument that had collective rights provisions included, out of fear that any sort of collective rights was part of the communist agenda. True story. So, when the UN Declaration, the first broad statement of collective rights, passed by an overwhelming majority of 143 votes in the UN General Assembly and voted on by the UK and later endorsed by the United States, this was a clearly important transformational moment in global politics. And to take it even further, the United States, when they endorsed the UN Declaration in 2010, even included a specific statement in support of collective rights of Indigenous peoples, the first time that the United States has ever even dared to do so. Second change. The UN Declaration morally, politically, and potentially legally corrects the discriminatory legal exclusions of Indigenous peoples that were present in the global decolonization project. Again, the Indigenous rights movement from its very earliest beginnings back in the 60s and 70s sought to correct two very important, highly discriminatory legal doctrines that have served as the legal foundation of settler colonial states. The doctrine of discovery and the saltwater or blue water thesis, exclusion of decolonization. Now, the doctrine of discovery originates from the papal bulls of the 16th century, and it justified European discovery, European claim, and exertions of sovereignty over all non-European, non-Christian lands and peoples. That's bad enough. But now the saltwater thesis is probably even more shocking because it doesn't come from the 16th century, it comes from the 20th. And so, for those of you who may not be terribly familiar with the United Nations decolonization project, I'll elaborate a bit. In 1960, the UN officially delegitimized colonial rule with its Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. And while this 1960 declaration proclaimed that all peoples have the right of self-determination, it offered no definition of the word peoples and offered no guidance on how to determine who was eligible for decolonization. So discussions and then a conflict arose between proponents of what would come to be called the Belgian thesis, led by Belgium, who argued that all peoples, including those colonized within states, were entitled to the right of self-determination. Then there were proponents of another argument, which came to be called the saltwater or blue water thesis, which argued that only non-contiguous colonial territories, those located over saltwater or over blue water, were actually eligible for decolonization. So this saltwater thesis found support among a very strange Cold War coalition. And I say strange because as far as I know, it's the only thing these particular parties agreed on during the entire Cold War. It was led by the settler colonial states of the Western Hemisphere, joined by Australia and New Zealand, and the Soviet Communist bloc, which considered the Belgian thesis, where all peoples were entitled to self-determination, to be a direct attack on the multi-ethnic Soviet Union. So as a consequence, the 20th century, late 20th century, produced for us the saltwater thesis in the decolonization project, and thus defined indigenous peoples right out of eligibility for decolonization. So the UN Declaration and the indigenous rights discourse in front of us at least delegitimize both of these principles in international law, normatively, and at least technically correct these exclusions. Although the question of how this will be done and how this will be accomplished remains an item of ongoing discussion on the global agenda, as well as within individual domestic contexts. Third change. The international indigenous rights movement sought and achieved, through the UN Declaration, a guiding framework for indigenous state relationships based on what we could think to be a new and emerging global understanding of self-determination. Now, Article 3 of the UN Declaration states that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination equal to all other peoples. So it's correcting the saltwater thesis. But at the same time, the Declaration also offers protections for existing state sovereignty and territorial integrity in Article 46. Now, with the decolonization project globally of overseas colonies largely complete, although not completely and entirely completed, the open question for those of us in this world is, well, what does self-determination mean then going forward? If it means something other than the establishment of a sovereign, independent territorial state, what does it mean? It means that the UN Declaration provides us a guiding framework for relationships between indigenous peoples and states that are based on principles like mutual respect, power sharing, resources sharing, consent, and ongoing political negotiations. It clearly articulates the expectations that states must cast off their old hierarchical power relations in favor of an entirely new paradigm. According to the text of the UN Declaration, Indigenous peoples' self-determination means, quote, they have the right to freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And it's said to include multiple possibilities, including self-government or autonomy or various other forms of political engagement with the state. One individual in an interview told me, what we seek is independence as nations, as peoples. We seek freedom and the space to live and govern ourselves as we see fit. That's self-determination. Being our own state could provide it, I suppose, yes, but so can many other ways of thinking and doing things. Now, the Declaration does not provide us with any universal prescriptive solution for what self-determination can or should mean in actual practice. And in fact, this is part of the paradigm shift. It's actually the antithesis of universal prescriptive solutions, sending us all to our individual contexts to sort it out. It provides space for negotiations of a multitude of political arrangements, and again, stated options ranging from full autonomy and self-government to full participation with the state. It's part of self-determination to make those agreements. And presumably, other options could come to exist in any sort of future imagining that we care to spend time on about sharing sovereignty. So the wider implication, if we play this all out, is that self-determination from this moment forward for this world can and means something different for everyone, other than the establishment of an independent territorial and sovereign state. So the meaning of self-determination and the meaning of decolonization is in an ongoing evolution, both globally and in individual contexts. And not only do Indigenous peoples seem to have a major role in that conversation, from my observation, they're leading the world in that conversation. So fourth change, and this was a fun one. I have found that the Indigenous rights movement, or what I call global Indigenous politics, is a unique force in global politics, because it is quietly and under the radar reshaping how politics can be done. It's reshaping how politics is done in the United Nations and in other international fora. And it's doing that in a way that is grounded in Indigenous ways of being. So these particular actors who've been present at the United Nations since the 1970s and 1980s have grassroots activist origins. This movement comes out of a deeply anti-colonial history in both nature and in practice and in theory, and it consistently and in a multitude of ways, if you pay attention, is challenging international structures of domination and subordination everywhere it touches. And at the same time that it's being so revolutionary, the individual actors and these groups of actors are also quite intelligent, strategic, creative, and articulate diplomats on the global stage, seeking a space of equality and dignity for Indigenous peoples. So when you're on the floor, you see them conducting themselves as any other diplomat, waiting for those moments to strike. And global Indigenous politics is therefore bringing forward ways of practicing global politics that fundamentally differ from the dominant set of state-centered practices. And by drawing on Indigenous ontologies, values, and commitments, global Indigenous politics offers a very new, or actually kind of old-made new, method of practice in international politics. And it does this in a number of ways. There has always been, among these actors, a heavy emphasis on consensus-based decision-making. And we saw this first appear at the initial global Indigenous conferences in the 1970s. So in 1977, in the Geneva Conference, which was the first time that Indigenous peoples gathered together in an international setting, notes that nightly meetings were held during which consensus was reached concerning the content and the structure of each day's work. And one delegate who had attended the 1977 conference back in Geneva explained to me how this traditional method of consensus had worked from his community that he brought forward into the group. He said, the whole idea of consensus is that all viewpoints are heard. And if there's a disagreement, then we have to deal with the particular aspects and the points of that disagreement and not just make some kind of blanket decision. As Indian people, he's older, so he uses the word Indian still. So he said, as Indian people, we do that. We have consensus, or we try to go by consensus. Usually, it's not even a vote. It's just a smaller group of elders helping make decisions in our ways. And I can say, I've been to many Indigenous caucus meetings over the years, and from my observations, consensus is always the primary objective and the process focus. If there's a vote, that's considered a failure because there will be winners and losers and antagonisms that come into play. However, the caucus is constrained by time and resources as much as any other political decision-making body, so occasionally a vote is taken, but again, that's considered a highly undesirable last resort. One activist described the difficulties in using consensus within the UN structure. And he told me the UN uses that word, consensus, but when they use it, it doesn't match our view. And in the end, the UN prefers voting methods. But she said, but again, if we call on our history, our culture, we just experience it and say, we need to give everyone a voice. So it's accepted, she said, and not discouraged, where I think in UN circles, it's discouraged to actually reach consensus. Secondly, you can see quite broad and open participation. And these have always been a core objective of the movement, which quite differs from state-centric diplomacies. Strong attention is paid to balance geographic inclusion among delegates, particularly to avoid North American domination due to advantages in fundraising and institutional development there. And achieving a mix of community-based people, tribal governments, political organizations has also always been a goal. Elders and youth are always included and often play a central role in meetings. Now, both the credentialing process and the UN speaking rules have consistently presented huge challenges to the open participation model of Indigenous peoples over the years, but the movement has successfully advocated through heavy means at times for important alterations to UN rules in order to permit this openness in both attendance and in speaking rights, and it continues this work. So the early activist movements that formed this international movement, especially the American Indian movement in the United States and the National Indian Brotherhood in Canada, were originally quite male-dominated, and both had leadership and participation that were predominantly male at the time, and were often criticized for their, shall we call it, certain warrior ethos that permeated movements at the time. Now, this pattern began to shift at the very first International Treaty Conference in 1974 as the direct action approach to activism started to give way to this more global diplomatic approach. And this newer approach was grounded in a much wider base of traditional Indigenous ways that included participation and leadership by elders, by youth, community leaders, many of whom are actually women. So women have been incredibly central to the caucus meetings that I've attended in Geneva and New York over the years, as well as the permanent forum sessions and Indigenous organization meetings and community consultations that I've been present at. So formal speakers now include nearly equal proportions of men and women. And at one particular board meeting, while only 4 of the 13 members were female, I would say their voices were what we could call disproportionately strong. When they spoke, the men listened. And you probably appreciate this because there was one Maori activist who told me later, it's good to have plenty of women on the council, strong women, and then the men too, who can put up with me because I'm the worst. But you know, I can't be ignored either, and they know it. And many organizations that regularly participate in the Indigenous rights movement have been founded by women, are headed by women, and women hold high leadership positions. I think this is unusual in global politics. This is a hard-fought one: cultural and spiritual groundedness. So in addition to resisting UN rules on participation, UN rules on speaking rights, Indigenous representatives had another struggle that began as early as 1977 in Geneva. They needed to insert Indigenous culture and spirituality into official conference proceedings, which, by the way, is completely against all UN policy. So the day before the 1977 first Indigenous conference in Geneva, the day before it opened, the Iroquois chiefs, the Haudenosaunee chiefs, presented the mayor of Geneva with an invitation wampum in an opening ceremony. He didn't quite know what to do about this, but he went along with it. And then multiple participants from the 77 conference and the 81 Geneva conferences have testified to their central importance in that they were going to seek cultural and spiritual grounding in achieving solidarity as a global Indigenous movement. One interviewee told me how difficult it was to engage in these practices in UN meetings with states. He said, sometimes at the UN, they don't know how to react, but other times they seem to feel good about it. It's just that they're all taught to keep it separate, politics and spirituality, and we're taught, and we believe, that it can't be separated. So at both the 77 and the 81 conferences, Indigenous peoples absolutely insisted on opening and closing all meetings with Indigenous expressions, be it prayers, ceremonies, or other displays, in direct contradiction to all UN standing rules and all UN procedures. They succeeded, and it's a tradition that has continued to this day and is now quite taken for granted, and the world didn't end. Now, this has been a key. Collective action as a sometimes necessary part of diplomacy. So again, this movement has internationalized from several grassroots origin movements, but always tried to stay grounded and connected to that activist and community base of support. So at the 74 Treaty Conference held at Standing Rock, South Dakota, some of you may have heard of that place. There's a reason that that place is a center for activism over and over and over again. At the 74 Treaty Conference at Standing Rock, the elders and the traditional leaders and all of the old AIM activists, at least the ones who weren't in jail at that point, deliberately shifted from AIM's direct action activist model into the international diplomacy model. So it's sometimes called the international arm of the American Indian movement for that reason. At the same time, on the Canadian side of the border, the leadership of George Manuel was also rooted in community activism. And a result of these origins, the Global Indigenous Caucus and people who participate is now made up of activists, which translates into often very strong personalities and individuals very deeply committed to their cause. Now, this movement, while it doesn't use direct action as its first choice, it won't hesitate to utilize some sort of collective action technique in order to challenge particular UN structures or systems that are not providing them fair, equal, or just access or accommodation. So during the last 3 decades, this movement, or portions of it, have engaged in occasional protests, walkouts, a hunger strike, and other actions at key critical junctures in order to draw attention to whatever UN structures or UN practices are creating an unjust situation. Because again, this is all supposed to be about human rights. So this is a graphic taken directly from my book, which shows us visually where indigenous rights as global change can occur, but where also the largest challenges are. So now, prior to the passage of the Declaration in 2007, international human rights law and discourse excluded two elements that were important and critical to indigenous peoples. First, again, as we discussed earlier, the international human rights regime did not include collective rights to maintain such things as culture, as language, religion, identity, or educational systems in the face of assimilated pressures. These rights, which I call soft rights, are shown in this box with the rounded corners. Secondly, and just as importantly, indigenous peoples' self-determination and their collective right to maintain their lands were specifically excluded by the decolonization regime and the saltwater thesis. So these are the hard rights that states, and particularly settler colonial states, resist most fiercely. The indigenous rights movement has aimed to secure self-determination and land rights with or without statehood in a shift that ultimately requires a global rethinking of how self-determination and land rights can be successfully decoupled from territorial sovereignty. Now, I delineate rights here into hard and soft categories in order to also draw out state responses. Hard rights, you'll see the explosion down here, strike at some of the fundamentals of the international system and the state system: land, territory, sovereignty, self-determination. And because indigenous groups are presenting and pushing for certain rearticulations of these, they are termed by me hard rights, to indicate both the difficulty in negotiation and also their threat to the hard core of state territorial sovereignty. Now, soft rights, which countries like yours and mine tend to accommodate quite well on the global scale, include things like culture, language, education, and religion. And these are collective rights extensions of existing human rights. So while recognition and protection of soft rights involves some changes to thinking about how we do human rights, the complementarity of collective rights to individual rights and the changes required by states and the UN system to secure those rights is not as fundamental. It's not as jarring as the changes brought forward by this explosion graphic on the bottom. And it's in this explosion section that has ignited the deepest battles with states over land and self-determination. So given all that, let's talk about implementation. Because the real promise here, the real potential, lies in how these rights get implemented. And when we're talking about reordering and rethinking state structures and sovereignty and institutions and legal and constitutional and legislative and policy changes, these are big issues. So here's another graphic taken from my book, which is related to indigenous rights and to norms. Now, the norms literature in international relations has not yet considered the possibility that fundamental normative shift could occur through norm change. In other words, that a norm could begin to evolve itself so that it actually starts to change the entire system. And I argue and find that the nature of global indigenous rights and politics is dual. And it operates both on the one hand to seek equality within the existing international order, as we know it, but it's doing something else at the same time. Because by seeking equality in the existing international order, it is actually pushing us into something potentially new. And it is sparking new conversations about what a new global order could or might potentially look like. But before anyone gets too celebratory, we have to recognize that states, all states, but especially wealthy and powerful states, are obviously heavily invested in the current order. And while there was near global consensus and original votes for or later endorsements for the UN Declaration, at least rhetorically, states can be expected in their actual behavior to be much more recalcitrant in their acceptance of indigenous rights, which means changing all their old ways of doing things. Now, several chapters in my book show that there have been some strange and unexpected patterns of state behavior where indigenous rights are concerned. And I say strange and unexpected from the perspective of international relations and human rights and compliance literatures, because they aren't that strange and expected from indigenous perspectives. So there are two that I just will touch on briefly. One is a pattern that I've observed that I called selective endorsement. This means that after originally voting for the UN Declaration in 2007, the four countries of what I call the Anglosphere, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, all those who voted no, did all later shift their positions to support or endorse during 2009 and 2010. However, each of these four countries also included almost identical qualifiers and exclusions about how the declaration is actually to be implemented into domestic law. So far from a full endorsement of indigenous rights, these four worked together and engaged in a much more nuanced behavior. By selectively endorsing, these four countries seem to be expressing and sometimes even emphasizing their support for indigenous rights, while also strategically, collectively, and most problematically, unilaterally writing down the consensus that was achieved globally in order to, by a magic wand, happen to align with their already existing status quo practices. The second one I call overcompliance, and this is also quite nuanced. And they happen to be the same four states. Now, an overcompliant state, and I put overcompliance in quotes for a reason, is one that paradoxically takes certain constitutional, legal, or policy actions that recognize or accommodate rights or a category of rights that go far beyond its own commitments. Now, it's not that they're over-exceeding on rights, it's just that they're keeping their commitments so low that it makes there appear to be a gap between what they're actually doing and what they've committed to. So it's a nuanced behavior that, like selective endorsement, keeps their expectations on them low enough so that they can interpret the status quo as already being in line with indigenous rights. And in some cases, they can claim something additional as extraordinary. So when we consider implementation of the Declaration, we should understand it in several ways. First, it does enjoy, at least rhetorically, universal support. There's not a single country currently on the record that opposes this document, at least officially. The UN General Assembly adopted it by a recorded vote of 143 in favor to 4 against, you know the 4, and 11 abstentions: Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Burundi, Colombia, Georgia, Kenya, Nigeria, Russian Federation, Samoa, and Ukraine. I challenge anyone to find a relationship between that list. It's random all over the map. But all 4 countries that voted against have since expressed a measure of support for the declaration. And among those that have abstained, Colombia and Samoa have now endorsed the declaration. Former UN Special Rapporteur James Anaya observed that the declaration has been embraced globally as the authoritative statement of norms concerning indigenous peoples on the basis of generally applicable human rights principles. And importantly, indigenous peoples now have an international instrument that provides them with a significant source of support in their struggle for recognition of and respect for their rights. Secondly, the Declaration, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was also adopted by a majority vote, not by consensus, is a source of relevant rules and rights, and it is also a mechanism to further their recognition and their implementation. It provides a guiding framework. So I'd like to highlight briefly some trends and good practices from around the world, many of which are drawn from a brand new, as in published just last week, book report from the United Nations called State of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and this is the 2019 version. So recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples varies hugely from country to country and from region to region. So if we take a brief look at some trends and good practices, we can highlight just a couple examples. Now, a number of states have undertaken legal and policy measures specifically aimed at securing and protecting the rights and interests of indigenous peoples. And the Declaration has provided quite significant clarity and support and helped fortify some legislation in some cases and mobilizing and facilitating the development of new and revised legislation and policy. Constitutional reform can also be an essential step towards ensuring the recognition, the inclusion, and the promotion of indigenous rights. And a number of countries in Latin America have been especially proactive in constitutional change. Judicial processes have also been informed by the Declaration and serve to set a precedent, and sometimes an important precedent, for protecting indigenous peoples' rights going forward, not only in the country making the decision, but potentially in other countries for those of us in the common law system. Now, Bolivia took a historic step when it approved in November 2007 the integration of the Declaration whole scale into domestic legislation. So far, it's the only country to do so. And their new constitution, adopted in 2009, is one of the most comprehensive instruments for recognizing indigenous peoples' rights, including the right to self-determination and self-government. Likewise, Ecuador, in its constitution in 2008, established an intercultural, plurinational, and plurilingual state, recognizing 21 collective rights for indigenous peoples. Their constitution also guarantees indigenous peoples' right to learn in their own language and a cultural environment through an intercultural bilingual educational system. El Salvador has also amended its constitution just in 2014 to recognize indigenous peoples. Several countries in Africa have officially supported the adoption of the UN Declaration. Some have implemented national legislation, and others have implemented policies in order to operationalize their commitments. Various national courts, Belize, Botswana, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Guatemala, Kenya, Mexico, and several other countries have cited the Declaration in court decisions on cases involving indigenous peoples, or have issued rulings aligned with the provision of the Declaration. National human rights institutions in countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Namibia, parts of the Russian Federation, and even the United States of America have used the Declaration as a framework for monitoring the implementation of indigenous peoples' rights at the national level. The Declaration has also contributed to increased regional cooperation, leading to the creation and elaboration of regional instruments dealing with indigenous peoples' rights. In October 2016, the European Union produced a joint staff working document entitled Implementing EU External Policy on Indigenous Peoples, which focuses on development cooperation and related policy execution. In 2016, the Organization of American States approved the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And the African Commission on Human and Indigenous Peoples' Rights and the African Court on Human and Peoples' Rights are leading the way in implementing the Declaration in Africa. Both entities have issued landmark decisions on the rights of indigenous peoples, with most cases relating to cultural rights and the rights to land, territories, and resources. As well, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has, in all of its relevant cases, drawn substantially on various articles from the Declaration in its analysis and its rulings. On the international level, the Declaration has spurred quite a number of developments. For more than a decade now, it's been used to set guidelines and standards to establish legal obligations. It's often cited as a reference. It serves as a source of information and inspiration, and it constitutes incontrovertible proof of rights and duties of Indigenous peoples. A number of organizations have developed policies and/or guidelines on engagement with Indigenous peoples, proper engagement. For example, the UN Development Program, the World Bank, the Inter-American and Asian Development Banks, and UNESCO. The World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO, in their Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge, and Folklore, is currently engaged in negotiations to secure agreement on international instruments designed to protect traditional knowledge. A host of UN agencies, programs, and related institutions have addressed Indigenous peoples' rights as they relate to business practices and to commercial activity. The UN published a handbook for parliamentarians in 2014, and that was the product of collaboration between various UN agencies on how to implement the declaration. The handbook is a practical instrument that enables parliamentarians from around the world to better understand Indigenous peoples' rights and provides some very pragmatic ideas for implementation. Also importantly, the UN Declaration has increasingly entered treaty bodies, and that gives increased consideration because they monitor human rights treaties vis-a-vis the situation of Indigenous peoples and are increasingly citing the Declaration. So these treaty bodies, such as the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Human Rights Committee, and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, are all charged with monitoring all states' compliance that have signed international treaties. These are legally binding on all states that are signatories. So these treaty bodies are increasingly utilizing the UN Declaration in their assessments of compliance, and therefore turning the Declaration into a legally binding instrument through these treaties. And let's just take the last few minutes and turn to Canada so that I can share where we are right now. It's quite a mixed picture. In June 2015, we had our Truth and Reconciliation Commission announce the release of its summary report along with 94 calls to action. And these 94 calls, which are intended to form the blueprint for reconciliation in Canada into the future, called upon every single layer of government in Canada, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, to make fundamental changes in their policies and their programs in order to repair the harm done by the century-long residential school program. And central to all of these 94 calls is call number 43, which says that everyone in government at all levels must fully adopt and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation in Canada, including a national action plan. So in total, 12 of the 94 calls to action specifically reference implementing the UN Declaration. The UN Declaration became a major issue during the 2015 federal election, which was launched in midsummer, just weeks on the heels of the June announcement by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Liberal Party leader at the time, Justin Trudeau, noted an urgent need for a renewed relationship between the federal government and the Indigenous peoples in Canada, one built on trust, recognition, and respect for rights, and a commitment that the status quo absolutely must end. And the full Liberal Party platform included a pledge to implement not only the TRC 94 calls to action, but a special focus on number 43, the adoption and implementation of the UN Declaration. And fueled by anger over the previous Prime Minister Harper's government policies on Indigenous peoples, including voter suppression legislation on reserves and a number of parliamentary actions that sparked the Idle No More movement in 2012, Indigenous peoples surged to the ballot box in 2015 with the highest voting rate ever seen in Canada, and helped Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party win that election. His mandate letters to his ministers right after that election included directives to implement the recommendations of the TRC, including implementation of the Declaration. And he stated in each one of those letters that no relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. Less than a year later, both Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould and Aboriginal Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett went to New York to address the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Wilson-Raybould spoke at the opening ceremony with a special statement on Canada's new position on the Declaration, on the Indian Act, on reconciliation, and the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. In this statement, she said and indicated to the world that there was need for Canada to reform the ways it conducts business with Indigenous peoples, and central to that role would be the UN Declaration moving forward. The very next day, Aboriginal Affairs Minister Carolyn Bennett addressed the first session of the UN Permanent Forum. She stated that her purpose in speaking that day was to address Canada's position on the Declaration. She announced that Canada would be hereafter a full supporter of the Declaration and without qualification. Following a very loud round of applause and a standing ovation, she continued, "We intend nothing less than to adopt and implement the Declaration." 4 years on, we do have some success to report. We have some appropriate legislation that helps to implement a couple key elements of the Declaration. Both of these were passed right under the wire at the end of June in 2019, right before Parliament rose. But we did get significant legislation on Indigenous languages, which if you look at those bullet points, it will look quite similar to Maori Language Act here in New Zealand. And we also have Bill C-92, an act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families. You might want to borrow this one. This was developed with a community engagement approach, and it affirms the rights of Indigenous jurisdiction over child and family services, something that's desperately needed for all of us. And it establishes national principles, including cultural continuity and substantive equality. In the meantime, we had a bill called C-262, not to be confused with Y-262. This is a Canadian 262, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. This is a piece of legislation that, if it had passed, would have ensured that the laws of Canada respected the Declaration. It was a very short and simple bill, and it only had 3 requirements: a review of federal legislation to ensure consistency with the minimum standards set out in the Declaration. Second, it was to require the federal government to work with Indigenous peoples collaboratively to develop a national action plan for implementation. And third, it was to require annual reporting to Parliament on progress made on implementation. The bill was adopted by the House of Commons and was further supported with a unanimous motion in the House of Commons. In the end, however, the opportunity to pass this legislation in the current session of Parliament was lost because the bill got stalled in the Senate and it died on the order paper when the Senate rose in June. But now it's election time again. Election was just called a couple days ago. The Liberal Party, the New Democrats, and the Greens have now all promised in some form or another to bring forward a similar government bill if they're elected. So we'll see. A few major initiatives that began in the last several years but never got off the ground included a working group of ministers to conduct a full review of federal laws, policies, and practices, and an Indigenous rights framework that would have replaced the 19th century Indian Act that's still in effect in our country in favor of a construction that would have aligned with the Declaration. Both of these were led by Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was the first Indigenous Justice Minister and Attorney General of Canada, but long story, resigned from office earlier this year in an ethics scandal involving the Prime Minister and a Quebec-based company called SNC-Lavalin. In June this year, we also had another inquiry make a report, the National Inquiry into the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which issued its final report in early June of this year. If you thought 94 calls to action were a lot to handle, this one gave us 231 more. Calls to justice. And again, there are significant points highlighting the need to implement the UN Declaration. And there is more specificity in these 231 calls than we even saw in the TRC calls. This one is very clear. It situates the Declaration squarely within the international treaties, the treaties and covenants that Canada has signed. And so I think it is moving towards enhancing the binding nature of the Declaration. And we also have a call for an Indigenous Rights Commissioner, which would be lovely to see. So just to wrap up, in my work, I've identified that there are a couple different pathways to implementation. What we could call institutional remedies, or a legal path, and then active deployment, or a political path. And implementing the Declaration through institutional remedies involves utilizing existing systems and existing structures on the international level and the domestic level in order to enhance Indigenous rights protections. So some of these strategies include what I've just been talking about: enhanced international instruments, domestic legislative frameworks. All of this is actively underway globally, federally in my country, also now provincially, where we're working on UN legislation in British Columbia, all across Canada, and in many other countries as well. And at the moment, quite a bit of energy is flowing into these strategies, and they are absolutely one essential element and component of implementation. And the Declaration can be cited in domestic and legal, international legal actions as well. And all of this work has been ongoing since 2007. And this is an essential element of implementation. And we do need enabling legislation for implementation. And we need it coupled with a review of policies and practices, both at the federal and provincial level in Canada and in other countries. We desperately need a national action plan, and we need annual reporting on progress. We also need compliance mechanisms, and we need mechanisms that are deemed objective and legitimate, both by governments and by Indigenous peoples. And all of these strategies help realign the legal and political orders that will better accept and respect Indigenous peoples' rights within those systems. And then there's the second pathway that I identify as the active deployment path. And this path is much more, I hate to say active again, but it's much more action-based and involves people on the ground. So this is an iterative process of invoking and reciting, deploying, and using over again politically and discursively in every avenue possible, international and domestically, Indigenous rights discussions and considerations. And it means repeatedly inserting the principles in domestic and transnational political movements, social movements, and discourses. And the discourse on Indigenous rights can be invoked in many contexts and in allied movements in such a manner that over time, just like human rights, they become normalized and expected. And implementation then happens quite naturally through a broad, repeated, iterative process. And this pathway is essential. So, implementation of rights can take multiple forms. And it also, in practice, will lead to reinterpretations of self-determination and as the meaning shifts from what we used to understand it as completely state-centric construction towards something entirely more complex, nuanced, and complicated. And states and indigenous peoples are charged with the heavy task of imagining and negotiating and recognizing various forms of plural sovereignty and power-sharing possibilities that will protect land, that will protect self-determination, and protect indigenous peoples' collective rights without causing necessarily complete disruption of the state system. We can fully expect that this process will be lengthy, it will be thoughtful, and it must be inclusive. But in the end, I think we can be confident that some new form of political relationship will be the result. And this is the formidable but necessary challenge of innovation and of imagination confronting all of us, but particularly those of you from a younger generation. And it will face us now and well into the coming decades. So I'm going to end there. Again in my language, Chimigwich, which means thank you very much. Thank you for listening, thank you for your time, and especially for coming out this afternoon.